Okay, so this week we're in Matthew 22, 15 through 22, and 34 through 40. The curriculum title is Honor, and I get it. They're talking about taxes and their huge application that we should honor our government and pay our taxes, and those are legitimate applications. To me, they're not the main point of this passage, though. This passage goes much deeper than that. As always, the intent here in this passage, or I should say not as always, but as we look at the intent in this passage, the Pharisees have teamed up with an unlikely partner, the Herodians, and then later on in verses 34 through 40, we see a lawyer. They're all asking Jesus questions, trying to trip him up, trying to find a legitimate reason to accuse him. So you just look at the passage, and I know the curriculum talks about this, but to me, this goes to the heart of something much deeper than the issue they brought up. The issue they brought up is just an issue they brought up in order to try to trap Jesus. I think the idea of wisdom, discernment, and understanding how to respond to enemies of the faith. This is what Jesus was doing. This is what you and I have to have wisdom about doing as well. To me, that's really the issue. I entitle this lesson Battle Tested. Notice in verse 15, they've plotted together. The Pharisees plotted together. And then in verse 16, they start talking about how wonderful Jesus is. So you know they're not being sincere. But prior to that, just a statement I've already made, the Pharisees and the Herodians are very unlikely partners. The Herodians were descendants of Herod. This is the Herod who plotted to kill Jesus as an infant. They were very loyal to Rome. So Pharisees, not obviously as interested in being loyal to Rome because they're Jews and Rome is over them. But now they're united, and they're united in their hatred of Jesus. That could be a good discussion question. How do we see this happening today? How do we see groups that normally are not friendly or not connected suddenly becoming unified by their hatred of Jesus and their hatred of truth? So I throw that out there as a good discussion question. Notice verse 16, the Pharisees don't approach Jesus themselves. They send their disciples. Now, probably, again, they're trying to entrap Jesus. They've had many encounters with Jesus. So they probably are thinking, well, Jesus is going to know we're up to something if we go. So we're going to send our disciples. Maybe he won't recognize them. And he will think these are part of the crowd that loves him, etc. So they're sending less conspicuous people. Page 108 of the curriculum, second paragraph, makes it sound like they're giving some credence to these statements that these people make as being sincere. Okay, so verse 16, teacher, we know that you're truthful. You teach the way of God in truth. You defer to no one. You're not partial to any. Those are not sincere statements. They're obviously trying to trip Jesus up. We're already told that in verse 15. Jesus perceives their malice in verse 18 and says, why are you testing me, you hypocrite? So there's no sense in which any of these statements are sincere at all. They're flattery. They're lying flattery. Psalm 5:9 and many other passages talk about this. For there is no truth in their mouth. Their inmost self is destruction. Their throat is an open grave. They flatter with their tongue. Now, the Pharisees are very specific in what tax they want to bring up. They bring up what is called the poll tax. This particular, and it would be paid by the denarius, and this particular coin would have a picture, an image, if you will, of Caesar on there. And they bring this up because of nobody likes taxes, but the Jews really despise this tax because it was used to help fund the Roman occupation of Israel, basically paying the salaries of the Roman soldiers. So, and the curriculum describes this as well. They're trying to trap Jesus because in their thinking, there was no way for Jesus to respond to this statement without either infuriating the Jews, because if he if he supports Rome, he's going to infuriate the Jews. If he doesn't pay the tax or believe in paying the tax, then he's an insurrectionist. And so there you have the perfect accusation to get the Romans to execute him. But by asking his question and getting their answer, and then his response, there's a very important word here. It's called render in some translations. In the New American Standard, which I'm reading, the translation of the curriculum says give, but that's a weak translation, because the term actually has the meaning of you owe something to someone. In other words, pay what you owe. You owe this. This is an obligation that you can't get out of. So by really emphasizing that, he kind of diffuses their ability to attack him for supporting Rome. And then, of course, they hear this, verse 22, they're amazed, and leaving him, they went their way. So obviously what they were trying to get out of this conversation, Jesus' way of responding really just totally did away with that. We can make some good application here, again, on how to deal wisely with underhanded attempts the world takes on us to attack us, to make truth seem like error. So again, discussion question, can you think of ways or questions, specific questions and ways that unbelievers do this today, how they try to discredit our faith with their questions? And there's a discussion question on page 109. What does it look like to honor our government in today's culture? Well, some obvious scriptures that you can present for that are 1 Timothy 2, 1 and 2. First of all, then I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgivings be made for all people, for kings and for all that are in high positions, that we may lead a peaceful and quiet life, godly and dignified in every way. So especially with the political stress and the political division there is in our country today, I think it's important for Christians to really get a hold of this truth, that they are supposed to pray for their leaders, regardless of whether you like them or not, regardless of whether they're wicked or not. The Roman government certainly was not, by any stretch of the imagination, moral or godly. Romans 13, 1 and 2, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. So, good question in the middle of page 109, but we must not forget, we must not forget the second part of Jesus' response, which is we're to give God the things that are God's. So we are to, that would be an interesting question. How does this passage, how well do we give back to God what we owe God, which we do? We owe him our tithes and offerings. It's part of our responsibility as believers. We wouldn't think to not pay our taxes even though we don't want to, because we don't want to go to jail, we don't want to have fines. But do we treat giving to God with the same, diligence? Another good discussion question is, how does this passage, plus the ones I just read, help us deal with the reality that the government uses our tax money to fund evil policies? In other words, we might be tempted, and some have decided, well, this tax money might be supporting abortion and supporting, same-sex stuff, whatever, so we're not going to pay our taxes. Never does Jesus bring up any loophole. Neither do these passages. The Roman government certainly was using these funds for lots of nefarious reasons. Jesus says you owe it to them. It's not your responsibility to worry about what they're doing with this money. It's your responsibility to be submissive to the government, to support them. And I think there's a lot of struggle that we might have with that. So Jesus doesn't qualify any of his conditions in which we are rendered to Caesar what is Caesar's. If you go to passage verses 34 through 40, some think this lawyer was more genuine in his questions. I do not. He was representative of the Pharisees. Notice verse 34, the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees. They gathered themselves together, so they have a little confab here and decide, okay, who are we going to send to Jesus this time? Last time we sent our disciples. Who are we going to send this time? So they send this lawyer. Okay, and even though it sounds like he's asking good questions, he's still part of this group that's trying to entrap Jesus. Now, I want to give you a quote from Muhammad. I want you to listen to the contrast between how Jesus answers the question of the greatest commandment of the law and how Muhammad answers basically the same question in the Quran. So this is Surah 225. Allah's apostle was asked, what is the best deed? Similar to what is the greatest commandment of the law? He replied, to believe in Allah and his apostle Muhammad. Well, what is the next in goodness? And he replies, to participate in jihad in Allah's cause. So Jesus says the second is like it. You should love your neighbors yourself. Muhammad's second commandment is kill those that are not obedient or not submissive to Allah. So you might want to throw that up to some of your Islam friends, Muslim friends. So Jesus' response, of course, I think we know this, is those two responses of love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbors yourself, cover all the law. They cover the 10 Commandments, which is a summary of the law, if you will. Maybe that's not the best word, but the first 5 commandments deal with how we manifest our love to God. They all deal with our relationship to God. The second 5 all deal with our relationship to people, how we love our neighbor as ourselves. And if you were obedient, perfectly obedient to both of those things, loving God with all your heart, mind, and soul, loving your neighbor as yourself, you're not going to sin. You're not going to break the law. Of course, none of us go through life without sinning. But so that, again, was one of these answers they didn't know what to do with. And again, they couldn't catch Jesus in his words. So we can really make a lot of applications out of this that I've already suggested. But overall, we want to have the same kind of wisdom when we're dealing with unbelievers who a lot of times are not genuine or sincere in their questions. They're just trying to discredit you, discredit your faith. Hope you have a good class, and we'll see you on Sunday.